We have just heard Jesus call his closest followers to consider the ravens and consider the lilies. For this is an act of discipleship. In this portion of Luke's gospel, Jesus has been growing in popularity and the crowds are gathering around him. And through Luke 12, the discussion weaves in and out of Jesus speaking with the large crowds and then speaking with his closest followers. By this point of the teaching, Jesus turns from the broad view of the crowd and he focuses in on his closest followers, his disciples, and he says to them, "Consider the ravens, consider the lilies." I wonder how often we slow down to do that sort of thing, to consider how important it really is to consider such things as ravens and lilies. Are they really worthy of our thought? Besides, isn't this seemingly light and frivolous kind of consideration the sort of thing you do once the real work is accomplished and you've finally carved out a bit of time for some leisure? Maybe the way I could ask that question in Cedar Rapids is, isn't consideration of this sort the sort of thing that you do in the 5th season of the year? And yet for Jesus, considering the ravens and the lilies is an invitation to the blessed life with God. Now, I suppose that is something well worth our consideration today, wouldn't you say? Speaking of this very passage, the great preacher and homiletician Fred Craddock put it this way: birds and flowers can be great teachers for us. Now, there's plenty that could be said about the ravens and the lilies, but there is more to consider than I have time to speak today. So I'll simply lift a lesson or two from each of these great teachers. The raven. Matthew gives the same lesson as Luke's gospel does, but in Matthew's gospel, it's not the raven, it's the birds of the air who deserve our attention. But Luke, in good fashion, is always looking to find the good news for the oppressed and the excluded ones. Therefore, Luke has it, consider the raven, that one who is often associated with death or with bad news in the mythologies. Even in the Bible, the raven is the first species mentioned in Genesis. We know it because it was the one who was sent out from Noah's ark before there was any sense of whether there would be a safe place to land or not. That raven never returned, either because it died trying to get back or because it found a way to survive all on its own. Consider it. God provides and sustains. Of all things, even the raven. If we give some thought to the raven, might our sense of the vastness of God's love expand? Could the raven remind us or even teach us of the boundless love of God for all creation? It's the raven, the teacher, who tells us the same thing Jesus said elsewhere when he said, God sends the rains on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. Consider the raven. And consider the lilies. If we do that, we're likely to recognize a subtle or maybe not so subtle criticism of the pursuit of wealth. Just prior to this passage where Jesus calls us to consideration, he's told the disciples and the larger crowd gathered a parable about the folly of a man who has a very bountiful harvest. So much so that he brought in more than he had room to store. So he had the idea that he would tear down his barns that weren't big enough and he would build bigger and bigger ones that could hold the vast wealth that he had amassed. He stored enough away that he could provide for years and years of his own well-being. And with this newfound sense of self-sufficiency and self-created comfort, he took it easy. He began to eat, to drink, and to be merry. But in the midst of his hoarding, it says God took his life. That all that he had amassed for himself could not be enjoyed, nor did it expand the length of his life in any way at all. With the story of the foolish man, Jesus offers this stern warning: watch out, guard yourself against all kinds of greed. And almost the antithesis of that foolish man who stored so much away. And in our passage, Jesus mentions wise Solomon, the one who ruled during the heyday of Israel's glory and power and wealth. But not even Solomon could compare to the splendor of the common lilies growing wild in a field. For they were adorned with a kind of beauty that comes from God, not something that came from their own toil or work. No wonder Jesus instructed his crowd and his disciples not to hoard nor to build bigger and bigger barns, as God provides the lilies and the ravens what they need. And if God does that, how much more so will God provide for us? There's one more lesson I'd like to lift up from the lilies today. God did not withhold the beauty of the lilies because they had a short lifespan. No, God did not hold back just because the flowers would go into the furnace the next day, as Jesus said. I want to be sensitive with what I'm about to say. But I'd suggest that our culture does not prepare us well to face the mysteries of life, and especially of our own temporal nature, and the mysteries of death. We shroud our language of death in euphemisms, as if we can't even say the words aloud. We can spend inordinate amounts of money to stave off even the appearance of aging. And these are only two signs of what one hospice organization calls a death-denying culture. But if we will consider the lilies, we may find there is so much divine beauty in the natural rhythms of both life and death. In truth, there's vast wisdom in natural and wild places, if we will slow down to consider things like ravens and lilies. In truth, that slowing down part isn't always so easy. At least it's not for me. The other day, before our roundtable team met to talk about this very passage, I had a few minutes at the end of my lunchtime before I came back to the church, and I thought, I'm going to take these few minutes and I'm going to go read this passage among some wildflowers. I think I could consider it in a different kind of way in that setting. So I went on a little search. It didn't take a long time, but I went on a little search, and I found plenty of manicured and tended flower beds in my search. Now, don't get me wrong, they were beautiful. But as I went looking for something that only God could have tended, I had a bit more trouble. This is the closest thing I could find. Laura, would you show that? Well, that's a little hard to see on the screen, but you may notice. You may not notice this part, but this is a picture I took near a trail by the school Charles goes to. And there are some wild things growing behind that fence, but they are surrounded by a fence and a sign saying, "Danger, keep out." And I trust that that fence and that sign are there for a very good reason. It is right next to my kid's school. I don't want him getting lost in there. And yet, with the task that I had in mind, reading this passage among some wild things, that fence and that sign became a powerful reminder to me that our constructed and our ordered lives can make it really difficult to consider much of anything. And before you tell me where I should have gone to find some wild things, just remember, I only had a few minutes and there's a lot of construction going on around the parsonage. It makes traveling a little difficult these days. With that being said, I do want you to tell me where I should have gone to find some wild things as well. But maybe I digress just a bit. It can be so easy to go through days and weeks in controlled and constructed places where there is little left that is wild. It can be hard to be in the presence of flowers that could only have been tended by God. As Stephanie, my spouse, tells me, that's especially true here in Iowa, as this state is the most ecologically altered state in the Union. Since 1850, Iowa has lost 99% of its prairies, 95% of its wetlands, and 75% of our forests have been cut down. Those are statistics from the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. To consider in the way of Jesus requires some intentionality. It requires some diligence, maybe even getting out of town for a bit. In truth, though, there is probably a deeper factor that makes it difficult to consider the lilies and the ravens. After all, the reason Jesus told us to consider them is that we would be freed. We might relinquish our worry and the control that often follows when we begin to worry. That we might put our trust in the God who provides enough for us all. It can be difficult to consider what Jesus calls us to consider. Yet if we do, we'll find the blessing of a deeper understanding of God's rich love. We will find the freedom of trusting in God. We will also find that we are part of an ecosystem that has enough for all that are within it. To hear the call to consider ravens and lilies is to be called back to a natural kind of wisdom. And that certainly will only come about with a holy kind of consideration. In our roundtable team, we were reminded that the colonizers who stepped foot upon this land saw how indigenous people grew food. They looked at it and all they could see were weeds. So they took those crops out and they put in row crops, monoculture, in their place. But there was a natural kind of wisdom to the ecosystem that the indigenous forms of agriculture recognized. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, were planted together, and they created that, a kind of ecosystem that was mutually beneficial to the whole, to each one. As Robin Wall Kimmerer put it, together these plants, the three sisters, feed people, they feed the land, and they feed our imaginations, telling us how we might live. The growing season is a time for us to recognize God's goodness and God's care to all of creation through the consideration of these natural and wild places. Now, we may not be able to get to a truly wild place, at least not in Iowa. But we can still find spots in the created world where the lines between sacred space, like the one we're in right here, and natural places, where those lines can become blurred a bit. In our roundtable team, we considered how a canopy of trees above a bike trail forms an entrance into a holy, sacred cathedral. For those who've made the trek out to Grandmother Oak at Prairie Woods, though battered by years and storms, she still holds out these majestic arms that create a safe and holy place for humans in need of shade, for animals looking for shelter, and for plants to flourish in her care. We are wise to consider how we can be part of sacred and wild places. Artist Daniel Popper created 8 large-scale sculptures that are currently on display at Morton Arboretum in Lisle, Illinois. The series is entitled Human Nature, and it invites us to see some of these deep connections between human and trees. Our family, visited in 2021, and each new sculpture created this moment of awe in the midst of something sacred, in the midst of something bigger than us. After a few hours of trekking around the Arboretum, some places you'd walk to, others you'd need to drive, we made our way by car to the final one, and it was called Basilica. Can we show the image of Basilica? For those unfamiliar with that term, basilica, it's a designation for a sacred and special church in the Roman Catholic tradition. Popper, the artist, wrote of this sculpture, "The hands create an atmosphere for us to enter into a meditative stillness and presence." Consider the ways the ravens, the lilies, the trees, and the natural world can embrace us and leave us in the presence of holiness. Our psalmist knew the importance of consideration in natural places. Psalm 8, even though it was one of the first things that we shared here today, was written as an evening song, something to hear and to consider under the light of the stars. When I look at your heavens, the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, the psalmist has us pray. May our liturgies continue to call us outside. For when we consider all of this, we open ourselves up to God's goodness. We open ourselves to the freedom of living with open hands and open hearts, and to the realization that we are part of an ecosystem where there is enough, as long as we're willing to unlearn greed and put our trust in the God who provides for ravens, for lilies, and for you, and for me. Amen.